Well, hello there, folks. Warren Buffett here. And I suppose you're wondering why I'm breaking my usual silence on matters that involve both the highest court in our land and the financial markets that have been so good to me and hopefully to you over these many decades. Now, I've lived through quite a few market cycles in my time, seen more than my share of what people like to call disasters, though I've learned that what looks like disaster to some often presents opportunity to others. But when the Supreme Court issues what they're calling an emergency ruling, well, that gets even an old fellow like me to sit up and take notice. I've always believed that the stock market is a voting machine in the short run, but a weighing machine in the long run. What we're seeing right now with all this uncertainty swirling around is that voting machine working overtime. People are scared, and when people are scared, they tend to make decisions that aren't always in their best long-term interest. Let me tell you something I learned a long time ago from my mentor, Ben Graham. He used to say that the market's job is to serve you, not to instruct you. Right now, the market is throwing what amounts to a tantrum, reacting to every piece of news, every rumor, every whisper from Washington as if the world were coming to an end tomorrow. But here's the thing, and this is why I felt compelled to speak up today. This Supreme Court ruling, while significant, is being misunderstood by a lot of very smart people who should know better. The court didn't suddenly decide to rewrite the Constitution or tear apart the fabric of American business. What they did was clarify something that needed clarifying, something that's been hanging over the markets like a dark cloud for longer than it should have been. I remember back in the 1970s, we had Watergate, we had oil embargoes, we had inflation that would make your head spin. People were convinced that America was finished, that our best days were behind us. I kept buying stocks, kept investing in American businesses because I knew something that a lot of folks had forgotten. America has an amazing capacity to adapt, to overcome, and to come out stronger on the other side of whatever challenge we're facing. The ruling that came down addresses some fundamental questions about corporate governance, about the relationship between federal oversight and state authority, about how businesses can operate in an environment where regulations were becoming increasingly contradictory and unpredictable. Now, I know that sounds dry as week-old toast, but the implications are anything but boring. See, what's been happening is that companies, particularly larger ones, have been operating in a kind of regulatory twilight zone. They'd follow federal guidelines in some areas, state guidelines in others, and sometimes those guidelines pulled in completely opposite directions. It was like trying to drive a car where the steering wheel and the brakes were controlled by different people who weren't talking to each other. This uncertainty wasn't just making business leaders nervous, it was making capital allocation decisions nearly impossible. How do you plan for the future when you don't know which set of rules you'll be playing by next year or next month or sometimes next week? I've been in the business of evaluating companies for longer than some of you have been alive, and I can tell you that uncertainty is the enemy of rational decision-making. When smart people can't predict the regulatory environment they'll be operating in, they tend to hoard cash, delay investments, and avoid taking the kinds of risks that drive innovation and job creation. The Supreme Court's ruling cuts through a lot of that uncertainty. It doesn't solve every problem, mind you, but it provides a framework that businesses can understand and plan around. And in my experience, when businesses can plan, they tend to invest. When they invest, they create jobs. When they create jobs, the economy grows. It's not rocket science, though sometimes we make it seem that way now. I want to be clear about something. This isn't political, and it shouldn't be viewed through a political lens. I've worked with administrations of both parties over the years, and I've learned that good policy is good policy regardless of which team proposes it. What matters is whether it creates an environment where American businesses can compete, innovate, and prosper. The markets haven't figured this out yet, which is why we're seeing all this volatility. Investors are looking at the headlines, seeing words like emergency and disaster, and hitting the sell button without taking the time to understand what's actually happening. That's creating some interesting opportunities for those of us who are willing to look beyond the noise and focus on the fundamentals. I've always said that our favorite holding period is forever, and that's because we invest in businesses, not stocks. We look for companies with strong competitive advantages, competent management teams, and the ability to generate cash over the long term. When you approach investing that way, short-term market volatility becomes less of a concern and more of an opportunity. The companies in our portfolio, the businesses we own outright through Berkshire Hathaway, they're going to keep making products, serving customers, and generating profits, regardless of what happens in Washington or what the talking heads on television say about Supreme Court rulings. That's the beauty of investing in productive assets rather than trying to predict market movements. And what troubles me most about the current situation isn't the market volatility, which is perfectly normal and actually healthy in the long run. What troubles me is the amount of misinformation that's being spread about what this ruling actually means. Too many people are making investment decisions based on headlines rather than facts, and that's a recipe for poor long-term returns. Let me walk you through what this ruling actually says, because I think once you understand the specifics, you'll see why I'm not losing any sleep over it and why you probably shouldn't either. The court was addressing a situation that had been building for years, where different federal agencies were interpreting the same laws in different ways, creating what lawyers like to call regulatory uncertainty, but what I prefer to call a mess. Now, I've been dealing with regulators for decades, and I can tell you that most of them are good people trying to do their jobs. But when you have one agency saying a company should do one thing and another agency saying they should do something completely different, well, that doesn't help anybody. It certainly doesn't help the companies trying to follow the rules, and it doesn't help the investors trying to figure out what those companies are worth. What the Supreme Court did was essentially say that when federal agencies disagree about how to interpret a law, there needs to be a clear process for resolving those disagreements. They didn't take sides on any particular policy issue. They just established a framework for making decisions more predictable and consistent. Think about it this way. If you were running a lemonade stand and one inspector told you that you needed to use paper cups while another inspector insisted you had to use plastic cups, you'd be in quite a pickle. You couldn't follow both rules at the same time, and no matter what you did, you'd be violating somebody's interpretation of the regulations. That's essentially what's been happening to American businesses, except instead of lemonade stands, we're talking about companies that employ millions of people and contribute trillions of dollars to our economy. The uncertainty was paralyzing, and paralysis is never good for economic growth. The emergency nature of this ruling wasn't because the sky was falling. It was because the economic costs of continued uncertainty were mounting every day. Every day that companies couldn't make clear decisions about investments, hiring, and expansion was a day of lost productivity and missed opportunities. I want to share something with you that might surprise some people. Over the past few months, I've been in conversations with executives from some of the largest companies in America, and almost without exception, they've told me that regulatory uncertainty was their biggest concern. Not competition, not technological change, not even economic conditions, but uncertainty about what the rules would be tomorrow. These are smart people running well-managed companies, and they were essentially paralyzed by indecision. They had cash on their balance sheets, they had profitable investment opportunities identified, but they couldn't pull the trigger because they didn't know which regulatory framework they'd be operating under 6 months from now. And that kind of uncertainty doesn't just hurt big companies, it hurts everyone. When large employers can't make investment decisions, they don't hire new workers. When they don't hire new workers, unemployment goes up. When unemployment goes up, consumer spending goes down. When consumer spending goes down, smaller businesses suffer. It's all connected. And uncertainty at the top of the economic pyramid tends to trickle down in ways that hurt ordinary working people. The Supreme Court's ruling provides the clarity that's been missing. It doesn't guarantee that every business decision will work out perfectly, but it does guarantee that businesses will know what rules they're playing by when they make those decisions. And that, my friends, is invaluable. Now, I know some of you are probably wondering about the political implications of all this. There's been a lot of talk about winners and losers, about which political party benefits from this ruling, about what it means for future elections. Frankly, I think that's all beside the point. Good economic policy isn't Democratic or Republican, it's just good policy. When businesses can operate predictably and efficiently, everyone benefits. Workers get better jobs, consumers get better products and services, and investors get better returns. The rising tide really does lift all boats, as long as the boats aren't sitting in dry dock because their captains can't figure out which way the wind is supposed to be blowing. I've been investing for more than 60 years now, and I've learned that the most successful companies are usually the ones that focus on serving their customers rather than trying to game whatever regulatory system they're operating under. This ruling helps those companies by creating a level playing field where success is determined by how well you serve your customers, not by how cleverly you navigate regulatory ambiguity. The market reaction we've been seeing tells me that a lot of investors haven't figured this out yet. They're still focused on the word emergency and emergency ruling without paying attention to what the ruling actually accomplishes. That creates opportunities for patient investors who are willing to look beyond the headlines and focus on the underlying business fundamentals. I've always believed that the best time to buy stocks is when other people are selling them for the wrong reasons. Right now, we have a lot of people selling stocks because they're worried about a Supreme Court ruling that actually makes the business environment more predictable, not less. That strikes me as exactly the kind of opportunity that long-term investors should be paying attention to. The companies that will benefit most from this ruling are the ones that have been conservative in their planning, that have maintained strong balance sheets, and that have been waiting for regulatory clarity before making major investments. These tend to be the same companies that make good long-term investments anyway, so we're essentially getting a chance to buy quality businesses at discounted prices. What I find most encouraging about this whole situation is that it reminds me why I've always been optimistic about America's long-term prospects. We have a system that, while sometimes slow and frustrating, ultimately tends to correct itself when things get too far out of whack. The Supreme Court didn't create this regulatory mess, but they stepped in to clean it up when it became clear that the mess was hurting the economy. That's exactly the kind of institutional strength that has made America the greatest wealth-creating machine in human history. When problems arise, we address them. When systems break down, we fix them. It doesn't always happen as quickly as we'd like, and the process isn't always pretty, but it happens. The businesses that understand this, that take the long view and position themselves for sustainable growth rather than trying to maximize short-term profits, these are the businesses that create lasting value for their shareholders, their employees, and their communities. These are also the businesses that tend to perform best when regulatory uncertainty is reduced and they can focus on what they do best. I think about some of the companies in our portfolio, businesses like Apple and Coca-Cola and American Express. These companies didn't become successful by trying to exploit regulatory loopholes or by betting on political outcomes. They became successful by building products and services that people want, by treating their customers and employees well, and by constantly working to improve their operations. The Supreme Court ruling doesn't change the fundamental value propositions of these businesses. People will still want smartphones and soft drinks and financial services. The companies that provide these products and services most effectively will continue to prosper. What the ruling does is remove some of the artificial constraints that were preventing these companies from investing in growth and innovation. I expect we'll start to see the effects of this clarity fairly quickly. Companies that have been sitting on cash will start deploying it more aggressively. Projects that were put on hold because of regulatory uncertainty will get green lights. Hiring plans that were postponed will move forward, and all of that economic activity will show up in earnings reports and employment statistics over the coming months. The stock market, being the forward-looking mechanism that it is, should start to reflect these improvements before they show up in the official data. That means investors who position themselves correctly now, while everyone else is still worried about the word emergency, could see some very attractive returns as the market begins to understand what this ruling really means. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that I think this ruling solves all of our economic challenges. We still have issues with infrastructure, with education, with healthcare costs, with income inequality. These are real problems that require real solutions, and a Supreme Court ruling about regulatory procedures isn't going to fix them overnight. But what this ruling does do is remove one significant obstacle to economic growth. And in my experience, when you remove obstacles to growth, growth tends to happen. American businesses are remarkably resilient and innovative when they're given clear rules and the freedom to operate within those rules. I'm reminded of something I learned many years ago from my friend Charlie Munger. He used to say that the best business decisions are often the ones that seem obvious in retrospect, but weren't obvious at the time they were made. I think that's what we have here. 5 years from now, people will look back at this ruling and wonder why everyone was so worried about it. The companies that recognize this opportunity now, that use this period of regulatory clarity to make smart investments in their future, will be the big winners. The investors who can see past the current market volatility and focus on these fundamental improvements will be winners too. As for Berkshire Hathaway, we're going to keep doing what we've always done. We're going to look for great businesses run by great people, and we're going to buy them at reasonable prices. We're going to hold them for the long term and let their earnings compound. And we're going to stay optimistic about America's ability to adapt, innovate, and prosper. The Supreme Court ruling gives me more confidence in that optimism, not less. It shows that our institutions still work, that when problems arise, solutions can be found, and that the rule of law still means something in this country. Those are the foundations upon which long-term wealth is built, and those foundations remain as strong as ever. So to everyone who's been worried about this so-called disaster, let me leave you with this thought. Every crisis contains opportunity, and every period of uncertainty eventually gives way to clarity. The smart money doesn't panic during times like these. It positions itself for the recovery that always follows. This ruling isn't the beginning of a disaster, it's the end of a period of confusion. And I, for one, am looking forward to what comes next. Thank you for listening, and remember, time is the friend of the wonderful business and the enemy of the poor one. Choose your investments wisely, think for the long term, and never bet against America. We've got this.